They were born into thrones of velvet and gold, yet lived in cages made of blood. The most powerful women of Europe's royal dynasties were celebrated as divine, chosen by God to carry the weight of kingdoms, yet their very veins carried a poison that no crown could hide. In the whispers of history, we are told of queens who moved armies, of empresses who reshaped nations, but rarely do we hear the darker truth that many of them were prisoners of their own ancestry, victims of a game where blood was currency and purity was obsession. Imagine the silence of a palace chamber, heavy curtains drawn, the air reeking of sickness and perfumes meant to mask it. A queen in her 20s lies in bed, her body frail though her crown is heavy, her features twisted by a legacy she never chose. Her family's obsession with preserving their so-called royal blood has stripped her of health, of beauty, of the simple freedom of life itself. Her ancestors had married their cousins, their uncles, even their nieces, all to keep the family line intact. The result was a body broken from birth, a mind often clouded by suffering, and a lineage that carried more sorrow than strength. To the outside world, these women glowed with jewels and gowns, adored by the masses as symbols of power and stability. But behind closed doors, midwives whispered about infant deformities, servants hushed the sounds of queens gasping for air in the night, and physicians took careful notes they dared not publish. Their portraits were carefully painted to erase the truth, the weak chins, the swollen jaws, the eyes that betrayed exhaustion. History immortalized them as figures of grandeur, yet their bones tell another story, one of deformity, stillbirths, and a slow crumbling of the body under the unbearable weight of centuries of inbreeding. What makes this truth more disturbing is not just the genetic decay, but a deliberate choice that fueled it. These women were sacrificed on the altar of dynastic survival, their bodies treated as vessels for power rather than as human beings. They were locked into marriages with cousins they had known since childhood, men who shared not only their blood but their flaws, and when their children were born weak or sickly, blame was never placed on the centuries-old practice of incest, but on the women themselves, condemned for failing in their sacred duty. This is the hidden history of Europe's most inbred royal women, and their stories are far darker than the gilded portraits hanging in palaces will ever reveal. One of the most infamous examples lies in the story of the Habsburg dynasty, where generations of royal women carried the crushing burden of a family desperate to preserve its grip on Europe. Their dynasty was powerful, spanning empires, but it came at a devastating cost. The Habsburgs married within their own blood for centuries, and the women of the line bore the consequences most visibly. Their faces became the silent record of this genetic entrapment. The protruding jaw, the misshapen mouths, the weary eyes that looked out from canvases painted in muted oils. Consider Margaret of Austria, born into unimaginable privilege, yet from her earliest days marked by the fate of her bloodline. She suffered from poor health, her body frail and her face distorted in ways her court painters worked desperately to soften. To the world, she was a princess destined to unite empires, yet in private, she was a child locked in a body breaking under the weight of history's choices. By the time she reached womanhood, her health was in ruins. She walked slowly, struggled to eat properly, and carried the melancholy that comes from a lifetime of pain. She lived only 21 years, barely old enough to be remembered, and yet her portrait hangs still, a ghostly reminder of what inbreeding carved into the flesh of royalty. Even more haunting was Mariana of Spain, a Habsburg queen whose very body bore the scars of a collapsing dynasty. Married to her uncle, a man nearly twice her age, her union was celebrated as a triumph of dynastic strategy. Yet it was little more than a death sentence. Her children were few and weak, plagued by miscarriages and early deaths, and the grief she carried hollowed her spirit. Those around her described her as devout, pious, yet constantly ill. She became a symbol of duty fulfilled at the cost of life itself, a figure trapped by chains of blood she never chose to wear. The Habsburg women were not anomalies. They were inevitabilities. They reveal what happens when human life is bent to the will of power, when purity becomes obsession, and when women's bodies are seen not as their own, but as vessels for dynastic survival. Their deaths came early, their suffering was long, and their bloodlines withered as if cursed. But this curse was no accident. It was crafted, calculated, and enforced by generations who believed that bloodlines mattered more than humanity. The story becomes even more chilling when we turn to Queen Juana of Castile, remembered in history as Juana the Mad. For centuries, her reputation has been dismissed as the product of hysteria, the fragile mind of a woman who could not bear the pressures of power. But beneath the cruel nickname lies a more unsettling truth. Juana was another victim of the dynastic cage, another daughter of the Habsburg bloodline, her body and mind shaped by centuries of genetic entrapment. Juana was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, rulers celebrated for uniting Spain, but their family too carried the seeds of inbreeding. Juana's marriage was arranged with Philip the Handsome, a man who shared her blood. From the moment she entered adulthood, her life became a battleground between her body, her mind, and the dynasty's expectations. She suffered from deep depression, bouts of rage, and obsessive attachments that her court could not understand. Historians now suspect that her so-called madness may have been compounded, even triggered, by the genetic fragility of her line. Her tragedy did not end with her illness. When Philip died suddenly, Juana's grief was so consuming that she followed his coffin for months, unable to part with the body of the man who had betrayed her with countless affairs. Chroniclers wrote of her wandering at night, kissing the casket, clinging to a corpse as though it were her only anchor in a world that had stripped her of everything else. She was locked away by her father, then by her son, and remained imprisoned for nearly 50 years. A queen by birth, yet a prisoner of both her family and her blood. Juana's life stands as a reminder of how the women of these dynasties were not only sacrificed physically but psychologically. They were forced into marriages with men they could not choose, expected to produce heirs from wombs, ready, weakened by generations of incest, and condemned when their minds or bodies broke under the weight of such cruelty. Juana's madness was not simply a personal flaw. It was the echo of a dynasty devouring itself, a dynasty where women bore the most visible scars. Her story, like so many others, is often reduced to rumor, myth, or scandal. Yet in the silence of archives and the careful analysis of historians, we see the darker picture. Juana was not merely mad. She was broken by a legacy designed to preserve power at the expense of life itself. But no figure embodies the crushing weight of royal inbreeding more completely than Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. His body and life were the ultimate testimony to the cruelty of a bloodline turned inward upon itself. While his story is often told through the lens of tragedy, the women around him, the mothers, the aunts, the queens who carried and birthed him, paid the greater hidden price. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his mother and his niece. The Habsburg obsession with keeping bloodlines pure had narrowed so drastically that by the time Charles was conceived, he was the genetic product of centuries of incest. For Mariana, the duty of bearing this heir was a sentence cloaked in velvet. She gave birth to a child so frail that every breath was a struggle. His body was twisted, his jaw grotesquely deformed, his tongue so large he could barely speak or chew. He did not walk until he was 8 years old, and even then only with difficulty. His entire existence was a living reminder of what inbreeding had wrought. And yet, it was Mariana who was blamed. Whispers spread in the court that she had cursed her own son, that her devotion to religion had invited the wrath of God. She endured the humiliation of physicians poking and prodding him, priests conducting exorcisms on the child who would one day be king. The reality was more terrifying. Charles was not cursed. He was the final, inevitable product of centuries of royal marriages that turned cousins into spouses and women into breeding vessels for power. For the women who bore these children, the suffering did not end with birth. They endured miscarriages, stillborn infants, and the silent terror of seeing their children fail to thrive. Their wombs became tombs for dynasties, their bodies collapsing under the strain of pregnancies that rarely produced healthy heirs. Mariana's Say, captured in portraiture, reveals a woman aged beyond her years, her eyes filled with exhaustion and resignation. She was not alone. Across the courts of Europe, queens and princesses were blamed for failures that belonged not to them, but to the cruel systems that had stripped them of choice. Charles II may be remembered as the king who could not rule, but the true horror lies in what his existence reveals. Behind him stands a line of royal women, mothers, sisters, aunts, each one carrying within her the fractured legacy of a dynasty obsessed with blood at the expense of humanity. As the Habsburg line withered under the weight of its own blood, Europe turned its eyes elsewhere. But the haunting reality is that the story of inbred royal women was not confined to Spain alone. Across the courts of France, Austria, and even England, the same quiet sacrifices were being made. Women were offered up as pawns, their lives dictated by charts of ancestry rather than their own desires. And the consequences of those choices rippled through their bodies in ways the portraits could never conceal. Take the Bourbon princesses of France, women born into unimaginable luxury, yet marked by fragile health, infertility, and short lives. Their unions, often with their own cousins or uncles, were arranged to maintain power within tightly guarded bloodlines. Behind the gilded gates of Versailles, miscarriages were whispered about as though they were shameful secrets, and physicians struggled to explain the high rate of stillbirths. The truth was known but never spoken. The obsession with purity had already sown its poison. Even in England, whispers of the same dangers crept into royal marriages. Though less severe than the Habsburgs, intermarriage among close relatives still left its scars. Queens who seemed radiant in public were privately tormented by fragile pregnancies, and children who did not live long enough to inherit the crowns prepared for them. These were not just personal tragedies, but dynastic failures for which women alone were blamed. And this is where the history becomes almost unbearable. These women were trapped. To refuse marriage was to betray their families. To resist childbirth was to invite scandal. And when the inevitable happened, when their bodies produced weakness instead of strength, they carried the blame in silence. The men who demanded these unions walked away untouched, while the women who bore their consequences became symbols of failure, their lives quietly erased from memory except as cautionary tales. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because few are willing to stare into the mirror of this history, to acknowledge how power consumed its own daughters. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have obeyed as they did, or broken the chain at any cost? The truth is that these women had no choice, and it is this lack of choice, this silent erasure of their humanity, that lingers like a shadow across centuries. The haunting part of this story is how deliberate it all was. The suffering of these women was not an accident of fate, but a calculated design, planned on parchment, sealed in treaties, and celebrated in court ceremonies. Every marriage was a transaction, every womb a battlefield where the survival of a dynasty was wagered. And through it all, the women were given no voice, only duties. Their names were written into family trees like branches bent inwards, curling until they snapped. For some, the torment was visible in their bodies. For others, it lived in the silence of their minds. Princesses raised in isolation, knowing from childhood that their future husbands were already chosen, often relatives they had grown up with. Imagine the slow, suffocating realization that the man you would be expected to love was also your cousin, your uncle, or even your nephew. That your duty to produce heirs would bind you to a life of sickness, grief, and early death. And yet, when history remembers them, it rarely remembers the torment. Instead, it remembers the grandeur of the dynasties, the opulence of palaces, the victories of kings. The women are reduced to footnotes, married young, died young, left no heirs. Their lives erased by the very system that consumed them, their voices silenced under the weight of propaganda that painted them as dutiful, pious, obedient. But behind the tapestries and gilded halls was another reality, a hidden network of midwives, servants and attendants who bore witness. They knew of the blood-soaked sheets, the stillborn children carried away in silence, the whispered prayers over infants who never lived long enough to be named. These witnesses carried the secrets that portraits would never show. The tragedy, of course, is that all of this suffering was for nothing. The very obsession with blood purity that was supposed to secure dynasties ultimately destroyed them. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with Charles II, the last sickly, childless king. Generations of women had given their bodies, their health and their lives to preserve a bloodline that collapsed under its own weight. What they endured was not noble sacrifice, it was slow annihilation disguised as tradition. And so their stories drift between silence and shadow, waiting for someone willing to uncover them, not as tales of queens in jewels, but as reminders of what happens when human beings are stripped of humanity in the name of power. When we stand in museums today, gazing at portraits of these royal women, we are invited to admire the jewels, the silks, the carefully arranged posture of queens who seem eternal, but the paint lies. Beneath the brushstrokes of flattery, their eyes tell another story. They are the eyes of women who were used, broken and discarded in service to a bloodline that consumed itself. Their beauty was curated, their sickness concealed, their humanity erased. And so the portraits become masks, haunting relics of suffering hidden in plain sight. The lesson buried in these forgotten lives is one that echoes far beyond palaces and crowns. When power becomes an obsession, when purity is prized above compassion, human beings are reduced to tools. The women of these dynasties remind us that history is not written only in wars and treaties, but in the silent tragedies of those who had no choice but to obey. Their stories are not merely curiosities of the past, they are warnings. Warnings of what happens when family is twisted into a prison, when love is replaced with duty, when bloodlines become shackles. Think of Queen Juana, locked away for half a century, her mind unraveling in loneliness. Think of Margaret of Austria, dead before her 22nd year, her body already ruined by a lineage she never asked for. Think of Mariana of Austria, forced to watch her son wither, blamed for a curse she did not create. These were not queens in fairy tales. They were women, flesh and bone, who lived and died under a weight that none of us could endure. Their voices were silenced, but the truth remains etched in their bones, in their portraits, in the private letters historians dig out from dusty archives. We are left to read between the lines, to uncover what the official histories tried to bury, and when we do, the picture that emerges is not one of divine majesty, but of human sufferings. A dynasty built on decay. In the end, the crowns were passed on, the empires shifted, and the palaces still stand. But the women who carried those bloodlines paid the price with their lives. They were the daughters of power, trapped in golden cages, remembered only as symbols when they should be remembered as victims. Victims of a legacy that chose blood over life, power over humanity, and silence over truth. That silence has lasted for centuries, but if you've listened this far, perhaps you've helped break it.